Thank you, John. Thank you guys very, very much. Boy, howdy, this is awesome. Thanks. Yeah, please be seated. Thank you. And thank you, John, for that awesome introduction. I see I've got 3 minutes left now after that. And I thank you all very much for inviting me to and letting me come to the Wings Over the Rockies to be with you for Wings Over the Rockies. It's a great program, a great location, a great venue. Some great airplanes in here too. If you haven't had a chance to walk around and see them yet, please take the time afterwards. All the Century Series airplanes are here. And we've got a couple of Navy airplanes here, which is a good deal. I thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about an airplane which is very close to my heart. In fact, it's by far the favorite airplane I ever strapped into, and that's the X-15. It was a tremendous airplane. It's probably the greatest airplane we will ever build, and it flew just as good as it looked. As World War II drew to an end, we had command of the skies. We had air superiority. There was no question about it, both Pacific and the European theaters. But we didn't have the newest technology. We didn't have the best technology in either aircraft design or mechanical design for aircraft, because our pride and joy for fighters was the P-51 Mustang. And the Germans already had several squadrons of the Me-263. It was a twin-jet fighter that they built that was over 100 miles an hour faster than the P-51 and couldn't maneuver as good, but you didn't really care about that. If you had the fastest airplane, if you were in a fight and you didn't like the way the dogfight was going, you could just run away and come back another day. So the Germans enjoyed about 100-mile-an-hour advantage over us well, that's a glass or a bottle of water. If anybody wants some water, there's one right down here. Thank you. Thank you, Miss Jenny. Oh, what was that? Okay, thanks. I can use that. So as World War II was winding down, we realized that we had air superiority, but it wasn't because we had the latest technology in the skies over Germany. It was because we just outproduced them and we just overwhelmed them with numbers. And then as the U.S. and the Soviet Union tensions began to grow, we realized we better get on the stick and upgrade our aerodynamic knowledge. So the NACA decided at that time, National Committee on Aeronautics, decided that we better form a group of highly competent engineers, aeronautical engineers, and go study about this flight regime around Mach 1, where we were losing control of airplanes and airplanes were breaking up in dogfights. So they formed this committee and they said, yeah, we better look at this speed regime around Mach 1, the speed of sound, and faster, and try to develop airplanes that can go faster and faster, because at that time speed was really looked like to be the key for success in the air, not necessarily altitude. So we started out with a series of airplanes, and the first of this series of rocket-powered research airplanes, purely research airplanes. They weren't meant to be fighters or carry any operational role or capability even. They were research. And the first one was the Bell X-1, which was designed to go Mach 1 and to study the region of flight as the shock wave formed on the wings and around the fuselage and moved back and forth and changed the handling characteristics of the airplane. The decision was made to first study that area very carefully. So the Bell Aircraft and the Air Force joined arms and built the X-1. The X-1 was designed to go Mach 1. It had about 6,000 pounds of thrust. It had 4 rocket chambers of 1,500 pounds thrust each that you could turn on and off. You couldn't throttle them like most rocket engines now can, but you could turn them on and off if you wanted to change your thrust. So it had about 6,000 pounds of thrust. It was designed to go Mach 1, and it did. Chuck and Jack Ridley got it out to Mach 1. They studied that area, that regime, and found out what was happening to the shock wave moving over the tail surfaces and how they could compensate for it. So they accomplished their mission to go on Mach 1. But that was only the beginning of the rocket research high-speed program at Edwards Air Force Base. The Navy joined elbows with NACA and designed an airplane that would go Mach 2. It was the D-558. It had the same engine as the X-1, but as you can see, this laser won't work. This laser pointer won't work on the screen, but it's the airplane on your right, and it was a beautiful airplane. God, it had sleek, swept wings, swept tail, beautiful looking airplane. A lot less drag than the X-1. And more fuel, so they were able to accelerate out faster. And Scott Crossfield got the X-2 out to the design speed of Mach 2, twice the speed of sound. Well, Chuck and the Air Force couldn't stand the thought of the Navy holding the world speed record in aircraft. So they got together in a back room and got some arguments that they were able to put together. Said, look, if we can add more fuel, more propellant to the X-1, we can burn the engine longer. Whoops. We can. I may have lost control here. I lost control. I got it back. So they put a section in right ahead of the wing, and you can see it's a little different coloration. Added more fuel, more propellant to the X-1, so they could burn the engine longer, and Chuck got it out. He said, I think we can go to 2.5, Mach 2.5. Well, he got almost to Mach 2.5, got out to 2.44, and as he banked to turn back into the dry lake bed to land, the adverse yaw, the drag on the outside wing, overcame the stability of the airplane, the longitudinal stability, yawed the nose out, and it went out of control and tumbled from about 94,000 feet down to 15,000 feet, where he finally recovered right over the lake bed, leveled out, and landed the airplane. He got back okay, and he got the airplane back okay, and he got out to almost Mach 2.5, but you couldn't entirely count it as successful. But the reason they didn't pursue it anymore was the next airplane in line to come along was the Bell X-2, and it was designed to go Mach 3. It had a larger engine. It had a 15,000-pound thrust engine. And Mel Apt was the test pilot on the X-2. He crawled in it, took off and launched from the B-52 mothership. From the B-52 mothership. And he launched and accelerated out, and he did reach Mach 2.87, almost Mach 3, which was the design speed. Banked to turn back into the field again to land, lost control for the same reason. Adverse yaw, the drag on the outside wing was greater than on the inside. It yawed out of control, tumbled, and we lost both the airplane and Mel on that flight. So that was not very successful. So the next airplane in this design line was going to be called the X-15, and the design goal for this was Mach 6. And altitude still was not a key factor on what they wanted to do. They wanted to get speed, really was the thing they were studying. So if you look at a performance chart, you can see that the kind of the oval on the lower left, or the orange oval on the lower left, is a design envelope for the X-1. It was designed to go out to Mach 1, and it did. It got to Mach 1 successfully. Studied and learned a lot about that region of flight. The next airplane was a D-558-2. It was designed to go Mach 2, and it achieved Mach 2. Scott Crossfield took it to Mach 2, turned around, got back to the field okay, and landed. The next one was the X-1A, the gray ellipsoid, and Chuck got it out to almost to 2.5 Mach number and lost control. He got it back. He stayed alive, but he couldn't hardly call it a success. The next one was the last orange oval at the top, and that was the X2. We got it out to almost Mach 3, just right at Mach 3, but it went out of control for the same reason that X1A was lost. Went out of control. Mel was killed and we lost the airplane. So this next airplane in line that was going to follow along and study as we expanded our speed envelope, the X-15, was a pretty gutsy step because it was going to go on out to Mach 6. Twice as fast as we'd ever been, a lot higher than we'd ever been. And I think the amazing thing is that that airplane was designed with 1950s technology. We didn't have computer flow dynamics, didn't have high-speed computers at that time. Engineers worked things out on slide rules. We had old inertial gyro systems that would precess under acceleration, so your instrumentation really wasn't all that good. There was no downlink data that came down from the airplane. You had to go out and try things, push it out a little farther on the next flight, see where it felt like you were getting in trouble, try and work around that and push out farther, and without any telemetry downlink to the ground. The cockpit in the X-15 looked pretty conventional. It had a bunch of round gauges, just like most airplanes do. It had more of them, but then you had a rocket engine systems to carry along with you and to control. So it made sense that you had to have more dials you had to look at. However, the X-15 differed from previous airplanes in another way. Let's see. Let me see. I don't have a pointer that works up there, and I'm terribly sorry. But it had a center stick, conventional center stick, but it was connected mechanically to a sidearm controller, which was one of the first times that we used sidearm controllers in airplanes. First time we really had to worry about it because of accelerations and vibration and stuff like that. So it had a sidearm controller, and on the left-hand side, it had the throttle. The throttleable. You got one that works? Yeah. Oh, super. Oh, great. Let's see. No, it won't. No, either that or I'm not pushing right. Those things are way too complicated for me. Yeah, that's okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So at any rate, the cockpit was pretty conventional, except there's just more things to watch, more switches to throw, and more buttons to push. One of the unique things about the X-15 was its landing gear. It had a tricycle landing gear, but instead of wheels in the back, right under the tail, you can, if you look real carefully at this photo, you could see the skids. There are two steel skids that would drop down. Now, the steel skids kept the engineers from having to protect rubber tires from the heat that was involved with the X-15 flights. And so the skids would come down, the nose wheel would drop down. The nose wheel was a rubber-tired wheel that was carried in the nose and protected from the heat in the nose, but you couldn't steer it. It was just a cast-ring nose gear. So it had two skids in the back and a nose wheel up front. The problem was that with the skids right back at the tail, once you touch down with the X-15, with the skids back here, as you know, the nose would start to fall through and drop through till the nose wheel hit. Well, pilots normally, when you touch down with the main gear, you start coming back on the stick, and you can control how fast the nose comes down. So you could get a really beautiful landing going. You could come in over the lake bed, have the chase talk you down to 3 feet, 2 feet, 1 foot, 6 inches, 3 inches. You think, oh, this is going to be good. And you think, God, I hope everybody on the base is watching this landing because this is going to be a good one. But as soon as the skids would hit, you couldn't control the nose falling through, so the nose would just slam down and slap down on the lake bed. You'll see this in the movie at the tail end. And so you'd think you really had it wired, thinking, I hope everybody on base is watching. That nose would slam down and jar your teeth. You think, God, I hope nobody saw that. It was one of those things that the airplane structurally was designed to take those loads, but it was something that pilots just don't like to do, is let things hit hard. Another feature on the X-15 was the tail. It had an extremely large tail, surface both above the fuselage and below the fuselage, and it was a wedge tail shape. It came to a point in the front, and it came out into a wedge, so that at hypersonic speeds, the air molecules took a while to get back together again on the back end of the tail, and it gave you about twice the directional stability as if it had just come to a point in the back, which was a good deal. It gave us a lot of directional stability, which is what this airplane really needed, what any airplane needs at high hypersonic speeds. This sort of illustrates the problem of the nose down, slap down. The top picture, you see the landing gear is just a little bit behind the center of gravity, so that when the landing gear touches down, you still got some leverage back there. You pull back on the stick and you can use the tail to let the nose come down gracefully. On the X-15, you didn't have that leverage. You could come back on the stick, but all it did was load the main landing gear up when the tail surface went up. You'd land, the tail would come up as the nose came down. The loads on the gear were increased with the air loads from what the pilot had put in. So we had to learn a very uncomfortable maneuver. As soon as you touch down, as soon as the landing skids touch down, you'd shove forward on the stick instead of come back, like you had taught to do your whole flying career. And as you slid forward on the stick, the slab went down, and aerodynamically it would unload the tail end of the airplane, which worked fine until you couldn't or forgot to do that, and then you just loaded the gear up. We almost lost Jack McKay. At Mud Lake. He had lit the engine and got an unstable light, engine light, and it was given the call to go ahead and jettison your fuel and try and land it on Mud Lake right below where you launched. Well, he had an electrical failure that day too, and so he couldn't jettison all his fuel. So the airplane was heavy. The airplane came down, hit, rebounded on the main gear, and it collapsed the main gear and rolled the airplane up on the lake bed. You'll see that in the movie, and I'll try and point that out. On the X-15, we flew basically two different profiles. We flew an altitude profile and a heating profile. The heating profile was, in fact, for that purpose, was to study the speeds, the shock waves, how they transferred back and forth on the airplane, and how they affected control of the airplane, and also how much the airplane was going to heat up at those hypersonic speeds. The airplane was made out of Inconel X. It's a very highly heat-resistant steel, and it was a heavy airplane. Steel was about 1/4 of an inch thick around the nose, around the cockpit area where the pilot was, and it got, as the airplane cooled down toward the tail, it got a little thinner down to about 1/8 of an inch. But it was all made out of steel, so it was a heavy airplane. So for the heating flights, we would launch at 45,000 feet, pull up about 30 degrees, push over, level out at 110,000 feet or so, and accelerate on out to the conditions that the test engineers wanted to have, and then maneuver to study how the shock waves would form and move back and forth on the airplane. The other profile I'll get to in just a minute, that's the altitude profile. But here's some of the temperatures. We would get temperatures up to close to 1,500 degrees centigrade on the skin, which of course would melt aluminum right away, so the purpose for the steel skin was obvious. We learned some things. Steel expands when you heat it up. Well, everybody knows that, but we didn't really think about that too carefully. The airplane itself was 50 feet long, and when you would get going above Mach 4, about Mach 4 or 4.5, the airplane would heat up and stretch in length. It would grow about 2.5 inches in length at those speeds, and so it would buckle and pop like an old oil can sitting out on the driveway on a hot day, And it was very disconcerting when you're flying along at 110,000 and you didn't want to move anything at all real quickly because you didn't want to overstress it or tear the wings off. You know, you just want to make tiny, smooth little teeny movements, like milking a church mouse. You just want to be very careful. And you'd get out to Mach 4, 4.1 or 2, and all of a sudden there'd be this big wham on the side of the cockpit, like somebody banging away with a sledgehammer. And it was the steel expanding, trying to expand on the outside. We didn't lose anything there. One of the things we found also was that when steel expands, glass doesn't expand near as much. So that picture on the lower right-hand side is the canopy. When we'd come back from these flights, every now and then the canopy would be crushed by these stresses from the steel expanding and would just glaze like an old car. You remember the old car windows and the back windows, and you leave them out in the hot day out on the parking lot, and you'd come back. You'd come back out. I'm going to hide that. You'd come back out, and the window would be glazed just from popping like that. Now it was kind of neat because I thought, boy, if I could just get one of those things to, if the right window would glaze over, you could always, when you got over the field, bank left and look out the left window and set up a left-hand turn to line up with the runway. Or opposite, if the left window glazed, you could set up a right-hand turn and come in. And you can't believe how badly I wanted to have a flight where I lost both windows, where both windows would glaze over, because you could keep going straight on the instruments. And then when you got over the field, if you had that happen, they had cleared us ahead of time. They said, okay, you can go ahead and blow the canopy when you get over the field, because we were in a spacesuit, you know, and had a visor down, and we didn't have any wind blast problems. And I really wanted to do that. Can't you imagine how cool that would be to go in Mach 6 or to fly into space and come back and pop the canopy, have an open canopy, open cockpit airplane. I even went down to one of the material stores in Lancaster and bought a silk scarf to stuff in my pocket. So if that ever happened, I could wrap it around my neck and throw it out the window. By the time the ground crew got there, you could wave to them. Didn't work. Let's see, after the heating, well, let me hit that. That's a good one. Bob Rushworth, I mentioned that above Mach 4, about 4.2 or so, the airplane would grow enough that it would stretch the cable. This is a simple lanyard cable that went back to a hook on the main gear, and the airplane would stretch, the cable didn't, and it would pull that latch open, pull the hook open. So you'd have a gear drop down maybe when you weren't expecting it. That happened to Bob Rushworth 3 times. Once at Mach 4.4, once at 4.5, and again at 4.4. So we didn't give him any slack. We made a plaque, a little tiny plaque you could stick on the glue on the cockpit, on the panel, that said, do not extend the gear above Mach 4. Now, these were back in the days before Velcro, so we didn't have Velcro. We could stick it up there so you could tear it off and throw it away. We had to glue it on. And so Bob had to live with that little red placard there. I'm going to press on through this slide and talk a little bit about the altitude profile, because that's the one where we were able to make, I think, probably more contributions toward the reentry directly that applied to the space shuttle. For the altitude profile, we would launch from 45,000 feet from the B-52, pull it up to 45 degrees, and climb out of the atmosphere at 45 degrees. Now, once you got to about 140,000 feet, you were above basically all the atmosphere there is, so you weren't going to affect anything. In fact, we had experiments that looked out the top of the airplane, infrared and ultraviolet, that they wanted the sweeps of the horizon, data on the horizon signature in ultraviolet and infrared. So we would coast on up to 250, 300,000 feet, roll over 90 degrees, get the instrument exposed to the horizon, and then sweep that instrument back and forth through the horizon. So they got a lot of good data, which was used in the guidance system on intercontinental ballistic missiles, we learned later. But the thing that helped out on the space shuttle probably as much as anything was to determine how to fly back in from space with a winged airplane. We couldn't just fall in because the airplane would go out of control. So we had to control it as we came into the different speed regions and learn how. The engineers at first, they said, well, here's what we think is going to happen. You're going to fly up and you're going to climb out of the atmosphere. And while you're above the atmosphere, then you'll control with a reaction control system. The little tiny jets in the wings for roll, in the nose for pitch and yaw. So you can control it with the reaction control jets. Then as you get back in the atmosphere, you get your hand off of that and go back to the center stick, and you can fly it like a conventional airplane. And it turns out that there isn't any simple break. In fact, they said that's one of the goals of our program. You guys are going to find out what that magic altitude is where you fly with aerodynamic surfaces up to a certain altitude, and then above that you'll be flying with reaction controls. And we found that it didn't work that way at all. It was a gradual transition from aerodynamic surface to reaction controls up high, and then as you re-enter, a gradual transition the other way. So we'd climb up to altitude with the X-15 at 45 degrees, and then we wanted to set up an angle of attack as you came back into the atmosphere of 26-degree angle of attack. So we could get up above the atmosphere, but when you're above the atmosphere, the angle of attack indicator didn't work anymore. So we would set up, kind of point back toward the field, and put the nose at about 20 degrees below the horizon. Kind of guess what 20 degrees was. And put the nose down 20 degrees. That minus the 45-degree entry angle we were coming in would give 25-degree angle of attack. So that we figured that'd be close enough, and it was. So we'd start back in, we'd line up with the field direction-wise, and then push the nose down about 20 degrees and hold that attitude as we fell back into the atmosphere. Then as the aerodynamics began to be effective, and we could start seeing what our angle of attack was, then we could pick up angle of attack, fly 26-degree angle of attack, hold that to break our rate of descent, and then as we broke the rate of descent, got to the bottom of dish out, in order to keep from skipping back out again, we'd push over and slow up, get the speed brakes out, and set up the overhead pattern and land. And that technique was the basic technique that the space shuttle re-entry control system was designed around. It sets up an attitude, picks up an angle of attack of 40 degrees, holds 40 degrees until it gets through the heating pulse down to about Mach 11, and then you set up and pitch over and fly around, set up your landing. I think, let's see, I think what I'd like to do is, when we were in the early design phases of the space shuttle, there was a very large influential community in the engineering world at NASA that said, you know, you got a big expensive airplane and you're going to talk about coming in at 18, 19 degree angle, glide angle, and that just doesn't make sense, doesn't sound right. You can't see to control your energy. If you don't have guidance needles, you'll never get it down. And so we were able to point out the fact that the performance of the space shuttle was about the same as the X-15, and that we had flown the X-15 a couple hundred times and landed it precision landing on the dry lake bed, so we were going to be able to do it. And by doing that, it saved the idea of having to put air-breathing engines, a packet of 4 air-breathing engines in the payload bay of the space shuttle, that when you re-entered, got slowed down below Mach 1, you would fold these engines out, start them up, and they would allow you to come in nice and flat and smooth and much more conventionally. But those engines would have taken up a third of the cargo bay, and it would have taken up all the cargo capability and weight, so we wouldn't have been able to carry any payloads. The comparison of the two, the angle, the approach angle that we would fly, when you roll out and you line up with a short of the runway to stabilize your energy and be ready for the flare and land. The altitude we would use for that in the X-15 was about 10 to 12,000 feet, and about 12 to 14,000 feet in the shuttle is what was estimated. So they were about the same. The final approach speed was the same. The maximum lift to drag, which means how many feet forward you can go to how many feet altitude you lose. Now, most gliders, and these gliders that you see in here, they range around 38 to 40, maybe 41 or 2 ratio of lift to drag, which allows you to come in very, very flat and nice and smooth and very conventionally. Not so much so with the space shuttle or with the X-15, but we wanted to get away having to put those engines on. So we used the argument that the performance was the same, so we would be able to demonstrate with a space shuttle that we could do it consistently. They had about the same performance, but the X-15 and the shuttle were not anywhere near the same in size. In fact, the X-15 would fit in the payload bay of the space shuttle, almost. It was, X-15 was 50 feet long, payload bay was 60 feet long, and but as Jeannie points out to me, her favorite airplane is a Navy F-4 Corsair, F-4U Corsair fighter. And all Navy fighters, fold the wings up to come in the hangar deck and get them in. So she says, she pointed out that we would have to fold the wings on the X-15 in order to make it fit in there, which wouldn't have worked anyway. Now, I'd like to show you this film. I have a 13-minute film that I think was made by Dr. Jim Young out at Edwards Air Force Base, who did, I thought, a tremendous job on a short history of the X-15 program. There are some things that I want to point out to you. When we first started flying the X-15, the big engine, the big rocket engine, was not through testing yet. So the big engine that we could throttle from 30,000 pound thrust to 60,000 pound thrust, it was not ready for flight. So we were flying with two engines that came off of airplanes that were in the museum, so don't tear up any of your engines here. Two engines, X1 engines. They were 4 chambers. They were 1,500 pounds thrust each, and they were mounted over/under like an over/under shotgun, and 4 engines above, 4 engines below. So on the in the movie, you'll see and you'll hear Scott Crossfield light up all 8 of those engines, and he's throwing 8 switches over here on his lower left. And he'll make a call to ground saying got 8 of them going. Of course, he says it like test pilots. That's the first thing you got to do when you're test pilots, learn to talk real deep and cool. I didn't have a deep voice, so I never got to do that. But, he says, I got 8 of them going. And of course, the guy comes back. If you're a controller, you got to have a higher voice than the pilot because you don't want to make the pilot sound bad. So he says, Roger, Scotty, you're looking real good. And you'll see that in here. You'll also see the nose gear slapdown. When the X-15 comes into touchdown, you'll see the landing gear come down. You'll see it approach the dry lake bed, and watch. Even if it's a very flat approach at the end, as soon as the skids touch, you'll see that nose slam down. And the other thing, then you'll also see you got a camera looking out behind the cockpit at the tail surface back here. So on the Mud Lake landing, on Jack's Mud Lake landing, as he comes down, as soon as it touches, you'll see a little spurt of dust, and you'll see this black stabilizer go full up, and that air loads and collapses the gear. You'll see the gear go, and you'll see it roll up. I wish we had really clear, high-fidelity footage camera, but this was in the 1950s, so that even having cameras was a luxury. So the photos are kind of grainy. They're a little scratchy from 60 years of sitting in places, but you'll get an idea of what it looked like to come back from space, to pitch over to get overhead, set up to turn the pattern and come in and land. So if we could, Ken, if we could have the movie, appreciate that. And then afterwards, I think we'll still have a little bit of time left, a few minutes anyway. I'd like to invite you to ask any questions you'd like to about that airplane, the X-15, or any airplane. And we'll go into that. So go ahead with the movie if you could, please.
On September 17th, 1959, one of the major stories in all of aerospace history got underway in the skies over Edwards Air Force Base as test pilot Scott Crossfield completed the first powered flight of the North American X-15. No other aircraft before or since has come close to approaching the truly awesome performance of this airplane. Under a joint NASA, Air Force, and Navy program, it was designed to explore the unknowns of hypersonic and exoatmospheric flight, controlled flight at speeds in excess of Mach 5 and to altitudes in excess of 250,000 feet. Its design was tailored to permit it to fly in this extreme environment, to withstand the searing, friction-generated 1,200-degree temperatures of re-entry. Its outer skin was fabricated from a special chrome-nickel alloy called Inconel X. To enable the pilot to maintain precise control as it exited the atmosphere, its nose and wingtips were configured with reaction controls, small hydrogen peroxide jet thrusters to provide pitch, yaw, and roll control. Finally, it was designed around a mammoth, single-chamber, throttleable rocket engine, the 57,000-pound thrust XLR-99. Because of delays in its development, however, the first 25 flights were made with an interim pair of uprated 4-chamber XLR-11s, providing a modest 16,000 pounds of thrust. As North American's pilot, Crossfield's job was to demonstrate the airworthiness of the X-15 and the proper functioning of its systems up to speeds approaching Mach 3. These initial tests were not without their hazards. Shortly after launch on the third powered flight, for example, an engine explosion rocked the airplane. Unable to jettison his fuel and LOX, Crossfield was forced to make an emergency landing with a heavy load of propellants that broke the back of the airplane just behind the cockpit as he touched down. He was uninjured, and the number 2 X-15 was repaired and restored to flight status. Meanwhile, as flight testing proceeded, the first XLR-99 was delivered to Edwards for ground tests. In June of 1960, Crossfield was seated in the cockpit of the number 3 X-15 when a malfunctioning valve caused a catastrophic explosion. Remarkably, once again, he was uninjured, and the airplane was rebuilt. Crossfield completed North American's program when he demonstrated the successful operation of the engine during 3 flights in November and December of 1960. During these flights, however, he'd been contractually limited to speeds just below Mach 3, and thus neither the airplane nor the engine had been taxed to anything close to its full potential, as a small group of government test pilots turned to the job of expanding the X-15's envelope. They included NASA's Joe Walker, Jack McKay, and Neil Armstrong, Air Force Majors Bob White and Bob Rushworth, and Navy Commander Forrest Peterson. The X-15's awesome potential was finally unleashed in the spring of 1961 when within the brief span of 8 months between March and November of that year, it became the first airplane in history to exceed Mach 4, 5, and 6. The man who made those flights, Major Bob White, was also the first to fly it in space, as he climbed above 314,000 feet the following year. And in August of 1963, NASA's Joe Walker took it all the way up to its peak altitude, 354,000 feet, more than 67 miles above the Earth's surface, a record which, to this day, still stands for a winged aircraft. But the program was concerned with much more than dazzling ultra-performance records. Throughout this early phase, the X-15's pilots collected mountains of critical research data on hypersonic stability and control, heating rates, and flight loads, while demonstrating that they could fly a winged vehicle out of the atmosphere, transition from conventional aerodynamic to reaction controls, and then return, and by means of energy management techniques, glide down to precision landings. As the program moved into the mid-60s, its focus shifted toward using the airplanes as test beds for more generic research on hypersonic phenomena, and to carry a wide variety of space science experiments into the near space environment. By that time, a new group of pilots was coming on board, including the Air Force's Captain Joe Engle, and Majors Pete Knight and Mike Adams, as well as NASA's Bill Dana and Milt Thompson. Each of their missions typically lasted only about 10 minutes, but the mental and physical demands imposed on them during that brief span were truly prodigious. On a typical altitude mission, for example, as the pilot lit the engine, he was slammed back into his seat by an instantaneous 2G acceleration. Pulling into a climb, within mere seconds, he was passing through Mach 3. While being subjected to ever-increasing G-forces during the climb, he had to maintain extraordinarily precise control. Each additional degree of climb angle beyond the planned profile, for example, could produce an increase of 7,500 feet in altitude. Engine burnout occurred 82 seconds after ignition, as he was passing through 150,000 feet at Mach 5. Almost instantaneously, the 4G loads pressing him against his seat plummeted to zero, an experience prompting Milt Thompson to quip that the X-15 was the only airplane he ever flew where he was glad when the engine quit. In sharp contrast to the tremendous forces which only moments before had pressed so heavily against him, he experienced the freedom of zero gravity as he coasted over the top of his flight path at 280,000 feet. About 3 minutes after exiting the atmosphere, he re-entered it at Mach 5 and started his pull-out at about 150,000 feet. Once again, he had to maintain incredibly precise control of the airplane as the G-forces built up to more than 5 Gs before he came level at 80,000 feet and began to set up his approach into Edwards, about 60 miles distant. Now his focus was on energy management. Technique and skill were critical here, for if he dissipated his speed and altitude too rapidly, he'd fall short of the base. Too slowly, and he'd overshoot it. As he neared Edwards, he banked into a 360-degree spiral approach to the lake bed, where the X-15 touched down at about 230 miles per hour. Not all missions went so smoothly. In November of 1962, Jack McKay lost power shortly after launch in the No. 2 aircraft and was forced to attempt a high-speed emergency landing at nearly 300 miles per hour on Mud Lake in Nevada. At touchdown, the left landing skid collapsed and the craft tumbled violently across the lake bed. Though seriously injured, McKay recovered to fly again. And while the twisted mass of the airplane appeared to be a total loss, it was rebuilt as the X-15A2. configured with a pair of jettisonable external propellant tanks that would nearly double the engine's burn time and thereby enable it to reach for higher speeds. It was also covered with a thermal protection coating to enable it to withstand the 2,000-degree temperatures predicted at those speeds. On October 3, 1967, Major Pete Knight launched from the B-52, lit his engine, and began to climb, consuming its propellants at a rate of 12,000 pounds per minute. The big engine drained the external tanks in just 67 seconds. And accelerating upward through 70,000 feet at Mach 2, Knight felt a sharp bump as they were jettisoned. Coming level at about 100,000 feet, he flew a perfect profile to a speed of Mach 6.7, 4,520 miles per hour. Flying at a speed more than twice that of a .50 caliber bullet, he was unaware of the ordeal endured by his craft. The thermal protection coating had failed as temperatures exceeded 3,000 degrees, and a dummy ramjet attached to the ventral tail had literally burned off, leaving a hole through which torch-like air was channeled into the X-15's tail section, where it burned out pressurization lines and electrical wiring that prevented him from jettisoning his propellants and lowering his landing flaps. By dint of exceptional piloting skill, he managed to bring the stricken airplane in for a safe landing. Charred by its wild ride through a hypersonic inferno, the X-15A2 would never fly again. And Pete Knight's record still remains the highest speed at which any man has ever flown in an airplane. When Bill Dana climbed out of the cockpit for the final time in October of 1968, it marked the end of a truly remarkable era in flight research. During 199 flights over a nearly 10-year span, the three X-15s had completely redefined the envelope as they mapped out the frontiers of hypersonic flight. 12 pilots had flown the X-15. 8 of them had qualified for astronauts' wings by flying an airplane in space. Sadly, one of them, Major Mike Adams, had lost his life when in November of 1967, the number 3 X-15 departed from controlled flight and broke apart during re-entry. A tragic loss that underscored the risks inherent in flight research. His death marred what is otherwise regarded as, by far, the most successful flight research program in history. Not only did it make major contributions to the more celebrated Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs, the knowledge gained from it made it possible for designers to proceed with the development of a true orbiting spaceship. When the space shuttles touched down on Rogers Dry Lake at Edwards more than a decade later, they were the direct beneficiaries of a small rocket plane that first bridged the gap between air and space.
That's it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much again for having us up here today and for letting us be part of your program, and thanks for coming and listening. Now we do have some time left. We got time for a few questions, I think. And yes, sir. I don't know a better way to do it than for just to me respond to hands that I see go up. And we got a microphone. Okay. Well, then we'll let the guy with the mic determine that. But we got some time, and so please let me hear what you want to hear.
Sorry, what? There you go. Okay, I think I'm on now.
There you go, you're on.
Thanks very much for your presentation. It was really interesting. Thank you. I wanted to ask a quick question about the space shuttle and specifically about STS-2. And I was wondering, after the flight, there was some pretty significant evidence that there was some major erosion on one of the O-rings on one of the solid rocket boosters. Was that flagged in your post-flight debriefs to your crew, you and Dick Truly? And if so, how was that actually presented?
had to do with a blow-by from the solid rocket boosters past the O-ring seals into the atmosphere. And yeah, we were aware of that. We knew that there was some blow-by. At that time there were two. There was a backup ring. There were two rings. And it had blown by the first ring but did not go past the second ring. And so the decision was made that it would be safe to press on and continue to fly. Now, the thing was, we didn't have extremely cold temperatures when we were flying that day. And when that O-ring, when the second O-ring failed, it was because on the stack, as the shuttle engines would start up, they were not lined up with the solid engines bolted down to the pad. So the main engines would start. When they got spun up and bringing the turbines up to speed, the whole stack would bend over and come back, and it took about 3.5 seconds for that operation to happen. The morning of the accident, those O-rings did the same thing that they did on all the flights. They compressed on the squeeze side, and then, but it was so cold, the rubber was cold, when the airplane sprung back, the O-ring didn't expand fast enough to seal, so there was additional blow-by. So, yeah, that condition, it was known that that condition was there. What was not understood really was not had anyway, was a good enough understanding that temperature would cause that to aggravate the recovery of the O-ring. But yeah, we were aware of that. Thank you. Yeah, well, where's the mic? The guy with the mic is king. Okay, no, go ahead up here. Maybe I can hear you.
Why did y'all keep on building the airplane instead of building a bigger and better one?
Oh, the X-15, why do we keep repairing it?
Yeah.
You know, nobody's thought about that, but I get a chuckle out of that every time, because it was the same airplane, it was the number 2 airplane that both exploded on the pad and rolled up on the toilet bed, broke the back on Scott's first landing. And the guy, Dr. Wright, keeps saying, you know, and the airplane was rebuilt and returned to flight. Well, that gets to be kind of funny after a while. But it was so much more economical to rebuild and repair it than to build a new airplane. The next new airplane, really, I guess you could consider, was going to be the X-20, the X-20 Dinosaur. And it was already in manufacturing process. It was going to be an orbital rocket airplane, not just go up and fall back into the atmosphere like the X-15. So that was the reason that it was economical enough to rebuild the airplane. There was enough flight testing to do on both the speed region and the altitude region of flight that the decision was made to rebuild the airplane and rebuild it, make it structurally strong again and go back and get more data. Thank you.
The question we have back here is, did they share with you in 1962 that a lot of the flight research was also going to develop the SR-71, which was also being produced in 62 and rolled out in 64 using the same thermodynamics, same flight characteristics as the X-15 did?
You know, I don't know how much influence the X-15 had on the SR's design. The SR came along, in fact, it started flying while we were still flying the X-15. So I'm not really sure that you could say if we hadn't had the X-15, we wouldn't have the SR. I don't think that's the case at all. But the same technology, the same aerothermodynamic technology that was learned from the X-15 was fed back into the design, and changes were made on the SR as it came down the production line, I know. So the two face similar things. The SR-71, as you know, was about a Mach 3 airplane, and the X-15 was a Mach 6.7 airplane. So there's no question that early aerothermodynamic heating lessons learned were applied to the SR. They they both experienced the same expansion problems. As you probably heard, the SR-71, it would sit cold on the ramp, and it had big cracks in the wing fuel tanks, big openings in the fuel tanks, and they wouldn't close until you took off and accelerated out, and the thermal expansion then squeezed the airplane closed. So there were lessons learned, but I think they came along more at the same time than sequentially, I think. Where's the mic?
Over here.
Okay.
First off, thanks for your presentation and coming out here. Second, there's been a lot of literature devoted to launching small satellites from high-flying aircraft, including a proposal for the X-15 to do that. And yet, not a lot has been accomplished with that. Is it just because it's really hard to shoot a space satellite from an airplane into orbit, or are there more other technical issues with just deploying satellites from aircraft that fly high?
That's a good question, because miniaturization continues to make the small mini satellite packages smaller and smaller. No, I think the real reason is that airplanes like the X-15 can get up into space, but once you get into space, then you've got to accelerate out 25,000 feet per second in order to have enough centripetal force to overcome the Earth's gravity. So it's not just getting up there, it's getting the velocity to going around the Earth also. So it's probably more of a propulsion problem than anything else. And smaller launch rockets, more efficient rocket launch systems have been developed too. So airplanes are still considered potentially as part of a launch system for a satellite, for a spaceship. But you still have to launch from the airplane and then accelerate from 400 or 500 miles an hour out to 17,000 miles an hour.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Engle, for gracing us with your presence today. 2 questions for you. Can you share with us what was the most memorable part of your service, both in the U.S. Air Force and as an astronaut?
What was my most memorable experience? Is that the question? You know, it's got to be flying this X-15. I've thought about that a lot, and I've had the privilege to fly a whole lot of different kinds of airplanes, and I really mean the privilege, because everybody would like to do it, and this timing is a lot of everything. But I've had the chance to fly 185 or so different airplanes, and including the space shuttle. And I think from a pilot standpoint, probably the most demanding time that you're flying, and yet the most rewarding time in my flight career has been in the cockpit of that X-15. It's just a very busy airplane to keep up with, but if you keep up with it and you keep communicating with it, talking intimately with it all the time, and keep ahead of it, it is a very rewarding flight. So I would have to say my favorite moments were in the cockpit of the X-15. And thank you for that question. That is a great question. John, I think we're off the hook.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming and congratulating, and we're so grateful to have him here, a true American hero, Major General Joe Engle.
Thank you, John.
You get 2 points there, sir. That's just one.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you all very, very much.